Gustav Courbet's painting The Origin of the World, created in 1866, stands as one of the most provocative and enduring works of art from the 19th century. A painting that has continued to stir conversation, debate, and scholarship well into the 21st century. To begin to understand it deeply, one must consider not only the immediate visual impact it has on the viewer, but also the environment from which it emerged, the biography of the artist who painted it, the series of historical and political contexts that shaped it, and the shifting attitudes toward erotic representation in art. Courbet's painting was never simply a painting of a woman's body. It was a challenge to the conventions of his time, an unflinching confrontation with Western ideas about modesty, sexuality, the nature of representation, and what constituted acceptable subject matter in so-called high art. By extension, exploring the origin of the world also means exploring Courbet's broader oeuvre, the realist movement he was instrumental in leading, and the complex and often combative world of mid-19th century French art. It is essential to situate The Origin of the World in the life story of Gustave Courbet himself. Born Jean Desiré Gustave Courbet on June 10, 1819, in the small town of Ornans in the Franche-Comté region of eastern France, he grew up in a relatively rural setting that would leave a lifelong imprint on his sensibilities and approach to art. Ornans, with its rural peasantry, rugged landscapes, and local customs, was far removed from the artistic and political power centers of Paris. Yet Courbet, from early on, was determined to make an impact on the art world, and he did so by forging a style that was very much at odds with the romanticism prevalent in the generation before him. Rather than painting mythical scenes or grand historical narratives peopled by heroic nudes and distant gods, Courbet focused on the world he knew, the people around him, and the social conditions that structured their lives. His art would draw heavily on observation, as well as a keen sensitivity to the changing currents of social and political thought that coursed through France in the mid-19th century. This attitude, which came to be known as realism, sought to free painting from the strictures of academic formulas and from the conceits of romantic lyricism, attempting instead to represent contemporary life in all its complexity, ordinariness, and at times rawness. In the years before The Origin of the World, Courbet produced a number of landmark works that established his reputation as both a master painter and a formidable provocateur. Among these were A Burial at Ornans 1849-1850 and The Stone Breakers 1849. A Burial at Ornans depicted an ordinary funeral in Courbet's hometown, spread across a large canvas typically reserved for history painting. Instead of heroic narratives from antiquity or grand moral allegories, viewers were presented with the plain reality of a local funeral, a kind of anti-heroic epic of the everyday. The Stone Breakers, lost now but once a cornerstone of his reputation, portrayed two men engaged in back-breaking labor, emphasizing the reality of physical toil rather than idealized notions of rural life. These works scandalized many critics of the time, who found them lacking the grace, nobility, and uplifting moral content that academic painting was supposed to convey. Yet Courbet's audacity also won him admirers who recognized the importance of what he was doing. He was carving out a new space in art, one that accorded dignity to ordinary people and everyday events, and one that recognized that the world of visual representation was too often divorced from lived reality. Courbet's The Painter's Studio, a real allegory summing up 7 years of my artistic life 1854-1855, was another pivotal piece. This large, complex painting brought together the artist, his friends, patrons, critics, and even political figures and ordinary people from all walks of life into a single allegorical space. The central figure was Courbet himself, at work on a painting, while figures to the right and left represented various aspects of the social milieu that influenced him. Although thematically quite different from The Origin of the World, The Painter's Studio shared the same radical impulse to question accepted norms in art. Courbet was painting life as he saw it, and his willingness to freely juxtapose allegorical symbols with quotidian reality served to underscore his independence from the rules and expectations of academic institutions and salon juries. Within this context of a rebellious and irreverent spirit, the origin of the world can be better understood. Painted in 1866, it was commissioned by the Ottoman diplomat and art collector Courbet. Bey was known for his fascination with erotic artworks, and he assembled a small but distinctive collection, presumably for private enjoyment. It is within this private and somewhat clandestine commission that Courbet found the freedom to produce one of the most frank and explicit depictions of female sexuality in the history of Western art. The painting itself is small and almost shockingly direct. It presents the lower torso of a naked woman, lying back on a bed, her legs parted, her genitals fully exposed. There are no mythological references, no fig leaves, no gentle veil of classical allegory. There is no context in the painting, no visible face, no distracting background details. It is a raw, disembodied, and fragmentary depiction of a woman's body. It places the viewer in the position of a voyeur, confronted with an image that would have been considered, at the time, scandalously pornographic had it been exhibited publicly. Indeed, it wasn't publicly displayed for over a century. Instead, it changed hands discreetly among private collectors, was often hidden behind other paintings or disguised in a wooden panel, and remained virtually unknown to the broader public until much later. The title itself, The Origin of the World, is a grand and evocative one, suggesting that this intimate part of the female anatomy is the source of life, the point of human origin. It is a conceptual leap from the strictly carnal to the existential and philosophical. By naming the painting in this way, Courbet invoked the larger themes of birth, creation, and the very genesis of humanity. Instead of couching these subjects in allegory, symbol, or myth, Courbet anchors them firmly in flesh. Through a simple, unvarnished depiction of a woman's body, he gestures toward the universal mystery of life's beginning. It is at once literal and symbolic. Literal in its depiction of the female form, symbolic in its suggestion that here lies the fountainhead of all human existence. This interplay between blunt realism and grand conceptual implication is part of what makes the painting so enduringly compelling and controversial. To understand how The Origin of the World resonated in its time, it's essential to remember that the 19th century was a period of intense debate about sexuality, morality, and the role of art in society. Paris, in particular, was undergoing rapid modernization, and bourgeois morality was both stringent and hypocritically flexible. On the one hand, prostitution was rampant, and erotic literature was widely consumed. But on the other, the official culture suppressed open displays of sexuality in polite society, and certainly in high art. Nudity in painting was acceptable only if it conformed to certain conventions. Classical nudes, for instance, or allegorical figures were permissible because they were cloaked in a narrative that neutralized their erotic charge. But Courbet's painting dispensed with these conventions and simply presented the female body as it was. This was a direct threat to the moral codes and visual protocols of the time, and it was something that neither critics nor the general public could easily process. That The Origin of the World was not publicly shown speaks volumes about the climate of the era. It was not just shocking, it was unshowable. If the painting's frankness isolated it from public display, it also aligned perfectly with Courbet's broader realist project. Realism, as Courbet conceived it, was not simply a style or a set of subjects. It was a philosophical stance that denied the necessity of relying on inherited conventions. Realist painting, he argued, should represent real, contemporary subjects in a truthful manner. This did not mean a naive mechanical copying of reality, but rather an art that drew its power from the immediate experience of the artist's world, rather than from a repertoire of established motifs. In this sense, a painting like The Origin of the World is utterly realist. It is a representation of something palpably real, immediate, and human. It demands that the viewer confront the physicality of existence, the fact that we are all born from a woman's body. Yet Courbet's realism often wrestled with questions of taste and decency. The Origin of the World takes this to an unprecedented extreme, making it an extreme test case for just how far realist art could push the boundaries of visual culture. The personal life and character of Courbet also inflect our understanding of the painting. Courbet was notoriously self-confident, rebellious, and politically engaged. He was deeply influenced by the revolutionary atmosphere of 1848, when France experienced a short-lived Republican revolution that he initially welcomed. Over the years, he championed individuality, freedom of expression, and opposed the conservative dictates of academic art institutions. He would become a politically active figure during the Paris Commune of 1871, after which he was accused of having participated in the dismantling of the Vendôme column. This involvement led to his exile in Switzerland in 1873, where he spent the remaining years of his life. Courbet's anti-establishment stance in politics was mirrored in his art. He was a painter who believed that to be honest in art was to be authentic, and authenticity sometimes meant challenging taboos. Painting a woman's genitals so explicitly was as much a political and philosophical act as it was an artistic decision. It questioned what was considered acceptable, who got to decide that acceptability, and what kind of truth art should tell about human existence and experience. Another aspect worth exploring is the reception and fate of The Origin of the World through time. Because the painting remained in private hands, passing through various owners, it developed a kind of legend around it. After Courbet's collection was sold, it passed to other private collectors, one of whom reportedly kept it hidden behind a painted door or another painting to shield it from casual view. In the 20th century, it was owned by the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who is said to have displayed it behind a panel painted by the surrealist André Masson. Lacan's ownership added a layer of psychoanalytic interpretation to the painting's history. For Freud and the psychoanalysts who followed him, sexuality was central to understanding human psychology, and the female anatomy occupied a complex and powerful symbolic place. Lacan's concealment and partial revelation of the painting almost acted out a drama of desire, taboo, and revelation that perfectly fitted a psychoanalytic reading of art and sexuality. When Lacan died, there were negotiations and legal wrangling over the painting, which eventually led to it being acquired by the French state and placed in the Musée d'Orsay in 1995. That year marked its first real public unveiling. After more than a century, The Origin of the World finally entered the public domain of art history. Visitors could stand before the painting, observe it openly, and interpret it as part of Courbet's oeuvre, and as part of the canon of Western art. Public display transformed the painting from a hidden erotic curiosity into a widely discussed masterpiece, prompting reevaluations of Courbet's legacy and the boundaries between pornography and art, aesthetic beauty and indecency, truth and taboo. The question of pornography versus art is a subtle and enduring one in the context of this painting. On one hand, The Origin of the World is undeniably explicit. It shows a woman's genitals in a manner that would still be considered graphic in many contexts. On the other hand, the painting is executed with Courbet's incomparable painterly skill. The handling of the flesh, the delicate rendering of the body hair, and the subtle modulations of tone and shadow all reflect the hand of a master. Unlike a crude, exploitative image, this is a painting suffused with the painter's intense observation and respect for form. Some argue that the painting transcends pornography precisely because it is not designed to titillate in the manner of erotic images created solely for sexual arousal. Instead, it forces a confrontation with the very fact of corporeality and the provenance of human life. It is realistic, yes, but it is also deeply symbolic, a statement about where we all come from, and a challenge to the artificial proprieties that govern the representation of the body. Historically, critics and historians have debated its meaning, sometimes reducing it to mere scandal, other times elevating it to a philosophical commentary. Both interpretations fail to capture its full complexity. The painting remains resistant to easy categorization, and that is perhaps part of its power. As for the question of the model's identity, it has long intrigued art historians. Rumors and speculations have circulated for decades. One recent theory suggests that the model might have been Constance Quaignoux, a dancer at the Paris Opera in the 19th century. For many years, no definitive evidence confirmed the identity of the model, and it was widely assumed that she might have been one of Courbet's lovers or an anonymous professional model. The speculation about her identity adds a layer of mystery to the painting, reinforcing its aura as an enigma. The absence of a face in the painting denies the viewer the ability to identify the subject as an individual. She is, in a sense, every woman and no one woman at the same time. This ambiguity leaves space for multiple interpretations. The painting is not a portrait, it is a concept, an icon, an image that resists being pinned down to a personal story. Yet, if indeed it was Constance Quainiox, who is believed to have been Courbet's mistress or a woman of some social standing, that would add another dimension to the work's history, grounding it once more in the social realities and secretive erotic networks of 19th century Paris. Exploring Courbet's other paintings provides a broader frame to understand why the origin of the world emerges as a logical, if extreme, extension of his aesthetic principles. One of his famous self-portraits, The Desperate Man 1843-1845, shows the young artist with wild eyes and disheveled hair, clutching his head in a gesture of intense emotion. Though painted before his realist manifesto took shape, it already shows Courbet's tendency toward direct confrontation with the viewer and a resistance to the genteel conventions of portraiture. His landscapes, too, such as the Wave Series 1869, reflect a powerful sense of the elemental forces of nature. When one sees these dramatic depictions of waves crashing against rocks, one senses Courbet's fascination with raw power and fundamental truths, whether they be physical, psychological, or social. Similarly, in his depictions of rural life and laborers, he aimed to render visible what had been made invisible by the refined tastes of the Parisian art world. He insisted on painting the world that surrounded him without the filters of sentimentality or myth. Many of Courbet's works were considered scandalous, or at least contentious in their own right. Young Ladies on the Banks of the Seine 1856-1857 depicted two women relaxing in contemporary dress, seemingly without chaperones, which suggested an improper display of female leisure and possible sexual availability. While far less explicit than The Origin of the World, it challenged the social codes that governed how women should appear in art. Another painting, Woman with a Parrot 1866, showed a nude woman lying languidly on a bed, a parrot perched near her. Though not nearly as explicit as The Origin of the World, Woman with a Parrot nonetheless raised eyebrows for its candid sensuality. This painting was actually exhibited at the Salon of 1866, causing a stir but not outright rejection. It is interesting to note that only a few months before he painted The Origin of the World, Courbet was already pushing boundaries of what constituted acceptable nudity in art. The Origin of the World, however, went significantly further and could not have hoped to be admitted into any public exhibition of the time. The question arises as to what Courbet's intentions might have been when painting The Origin of the World. Since it was a private commission, he likely felt free of the constraints he would have faced in a more public or official context. Knowing that it would be seen by very few people, possibly only by Courbet and his select guests, Courbet could give full rein to his realism and his desire to strip away the veils of convention. He may have viewed this as an opportunity to create a sort of philosophical manifesto in paint, a quiet yet radical statement that would remain hidden from the disapproving eyes of the public. By doing so, Courbet anticipated modern conceptions of art that see it as not merely decorative or didactic, but as inherently challenging and provocative. It also foreshadowed later modern artists who would directly confront sexual subject matter. One could even argue that The Origin of the World predates certain aspects of modernism, when artists would increasingly insist on the autonomy of art from moral and social constraints, and when the depiction of sexuality would become more openly explored. Furthermore, the painting's eventual emergence into public view in the 20th century and its placement in the Musée d'Orsay in the late 20th century coincided with a period of profound shifts in cultural attitudes towards sexuality, feminism, censorship, and the role of museums. By the 1990s, when the painting became widely known, discussions about gender representation, the male gaze, and the objectification of women's bodies were well underway in academic and artistic communities. Feminist scholars and critics scrutinized works like The Origin of the World in terms of power dynamics and representation. Was Courbet's painting simply perpetuating the objectification of the female body for a male viewer? Or was it a radical and honest depiction of female sexuality that challenged traditional notions of passive, idealized female nudes? The painting could be interpreted in multiple, even contradictory ways. Some see it as a liberating recognition of female anatomy and sexuality, while others see it as emblematic of a long tradition of male voyeurism. The tensions between these interpretations reflect the complexity of the painting itself, which resists being pinned down to a single reading. In recent decades, scholars have gone beyond the initial shock value and sought to understand the painting in the context of Courbet's entire career and the broader socio-cultural environment of 19th century France. This has included looking at Courbet's letters, his relationship with models and patrons, and the pattern of censorship and scandal that surrounded many of his works. Some art historians have analyzed the painting's painterly qualities, its brushwork, use of light and shadow, and attention to detail in order to better understand the aesthetic considerations that informed it. The painting is not a rushed, lurid image. It is a carefully composed study. The subtle color transitions, the careful articulation of form, and the attention to texture all reveal the hand of an accomplished painter, deeply engaged with the material of paint and the representation of flesh. It is also interesting to consider the broader movement of realism and how Courbet's work influenced subsequent generations of artists. The realist movement itself was about more than just depicting reality. It was also about questioning who gets represented and how. Courbet's works encouraged younger artists to break free from academic traditions and to paint subjects drawn from their immediate experience. Later artists like Edouard Manet, who scandalized the art world with Olympia in 1863 and other works that treated the nude and modern life with unprecedented frankness, owe a debt to Courbet's pioneering defiance of convention. Although Manet's Olympia preceded The Origin of the World, Courbet's work represented an even more radical step in the direction of sexual frankness. And after them, the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists continued to challenge norms. By the time the Surrealists and Expressionists emerged in the early 20th century, the notion that art should shock and provoke had been thoroughly integrated into the avant-garde tradition. In this line of progression, The Origin of the World can be seen as an early seed of the transgressions and expansions of artistic subject matter that would characterize modern and contemporary art. Throughout the 20th century, The Origin of the World remained a somewhat legendary painting. Its secrecy added to its mystique, as did the knowledge that it depicted something too scandalous to be shown. When it finally surfaced publicly, it did so at a time when art museums were increasingly committed to showing the full range of artistic expression, even when it challenged public sensibilities. The Musée d'Orsay, with its collection focused on 19th century art, was a fitting home. There, it hangs among other groundbreaking works of realism, impressionism, and symbolism, allowing viewers to place it in context. Confronting the painting in a museum setting can be an unsettling experience for some viewers, who might not expect such frankness in a venerable institution. Yet this tension is precisely what makes the painting continue to resonate. It poses enduring questions about what we consider obscene or acceptable, what we think art should do, and how we negotiate the public display of private truths. Beyond this particular painting, Courbet's influence and reputation rest on a wide array of works that captured the France of his time. He painted landscapes, portraits, scenes of rural life, hunting scenes, and still lifes. He returned repeatedly to themes drawn from Ornans, his hometown, and to motifs that expressed his love for nature and his appreciation for tangible reality. Even after decades of controversy and shifting taste, Courbet remains a central figure in the transition from traditional academic painting to modern art. His insistence on painting what he saw, what he knew, and what mattered to him paved the way for others to do the same in their own terms. One could argue that The Origin of the World is a painting that marries the cosmic and the quotidian. On the one hand, it is just a painting of a naked woman's genitals, something that could be considered mundane and even lurid. On the other hand, the title and the presentation elevate this image to an archetypal level, suggesting that within this intimate fragment of anatomy lies the key to life itself. The tension between these two poles, between the banal and the universal, the private and the cosmic, gives the painting an enduring fascination. Although some viewers may still find it confrontational or shocking, others find it beautiful, powerful, or even tender. It acknowledges that life's most profound realities are grounded in flesh, and that art can serve as a mirror that reflects truths we often prefer to hide. In reviewing Courbet's career and the place of The Origin of the World within it, one can also think about the shifting notions of artistic courage. In Courbet's time, painting such a subject was not only scandalous, it was practically career suicide if done for public consumption. Yet Courbet persisted in pushing boundaries, convinced that art needed to be free, and that freedom included the freedom to face the truths of the human condition. Today, while explicit imagery is far more common, the painting still retains its shock value because of its art historical context and the unapologetic directness with which it presents the body. In an era saturated with sexual imagery, much of it commercialized and trivialized, The Origin of the World can feel strangely pure and sincere. It does not cater to the viewer's desire for comfort, nor does it aestheticize or romanticize the body. Instead, it simply shows, and by showing it asserts an uncomfortable kind of honesty. As we step back and consider Courbet's other works alongside The Origin of the World, we see a man dedicated to authenticity. Whether painting the funeral of a humble villager, the rough hands of laborers, the twisting forms of rocks and waves, or the most intimate aspect of a woman's body, Courbet pursued a vision of truth in representation that was both radical and self-assured. His legacy has influenced countless artists who followed, who understood that art need not rely on inherited styles and subjects, but could confront the world as it is. This legacy can be felt in the many modern and contemporary artists who have engaged with issues of sexuality, gender, identity, and the body in ways that Courbet opened the door for, even if unwittingly. To fully appreciate The Origin of the World, one must recognize it as more than a curiosity or a sensational image. It is a work that forces us to question what we value in art, what we fear, and what we hide. It invites us to consider how deeply our aesthetic sensibilities are entangled with social norms, moral codes, and power structures. And it allows us to reflect on how drastically the reception of a work of art can change over time, as our collective attitudes and context shift. For Courbet, painting was not a retreat into a separate aesthetic universe. It was a way of engaging with the world, and nothing was off-limits if it was part of the reality he wanted to depict. That courage, that willingness to put forth an image that would surely scandalize his contemporaries, is a hallmark of his greatness as an artist. In the end, The Origin of the World stands as a stark testament to Courbet's realist philosophy. Realism, for Courbet, meant facing the truth of existence head-on. It meant not turning away from the raw facts of life, even those aspects that polite society preferred to ignore. This painting serves as an ultimate statement of that principle. By choosing a subject so intensely taboo, Courbet set a challenge for centuries to come. The challenge is not only about how to represent the body, but also about how to reckon with the fundamental mysteries of life and creation without resorting to myth, fiction, or censorship. Over 150 years later, the painting continues to provoke thought, elicit strong reactions, and inspire discussions about art, morality, sexuality, and the role of the artist in society. That ongoing vitality, that refusal to become a mere artifact of the past, is the mark of a true masterpiece.